He was once called the Godslayer, a man forged in blood and steel, the Vortex Legion's deadliest weapon, a name whispered in fear across 100 worlds. Now, Zorak Veyn hides among the whispering trees of Eryndor, swinging an axe instead of a blade, until the night a silver tree splits open and she steps out. Emerald skin, violet eyes blazing with a lust that could burn stars. She's no woman. She's a force, a storm, and one touch from her drags him back into a war he swore to leave behind. Buckle up. This isn't just a story. It's a galactic collision of power and passion. Loving the heat already? Hit that subscribe button. Alien Whispers your ticket to sci-fi epics packed with chaos, heart, and twists you'll never see coming. Zorak Veyn had once been a name that echoed through the galaxy like a death knell. They called him the Godslayer, Vortex Legion's perfect killer, a man who'd shattered fleets with his bare hands and left planets smoking in his wake. His fist could crack titanium, his reflexes danced with blaster fire, and his eyes, gray as a storm, saw through every lie. That was 10 years ago. Now he stood in a misty clearing on Eryndor, shirtless and scarred, driving an axe into a log with a grunt. The blade sank deep, with splintering under the blow, but it wasn't enough to drown out the screams in his head. The wars were over, the blood had dried, and yet peace remained a stranger. Master, you're wasting perfectly good murder muscles on that. The voice was shrill, metallic, and dripping with sass. Zorak didn't glance back. He knew it was Crix 7, his pint-sized droid shadow, stomping through the moss with all the grace of a drunk toddler. The little bot's scratched steel frame caught the dim light filtering through Eryndor's towering canopy, its red eyes glowing like warning lights. I mean, come on. You used to snap necks like twigs. Now you're what? Playing lumberjack? Where's the gore? The glory? Quiet, Crix, Zorak muttered, his voice a low rumble, rough as a blade dragged over stone. He wiped sweat from his brow, the faint gleam of subdermal implants catching a mist. I'm done with that life. Done. Crix, 7 snorted, kicking a rock with a clang. You're the guy who punched a hole through a dreadnought's hull and walked away whistling. The Godslayer doesn't just retire to chop wood. What's next, knitting? Baking cookies? Oh, please tell me we're baking cookies. I'll rig the oven to explode. Zorak swung the axe again, ignoring the jab. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, Eryndor's endless forest stretching around him like a living fortress. Trees loomed high, their silver bark shimmering faintly, roots twisting through the soil like ancient veins. He'd built his cabin here, a rough pile of logs and stone, to bury the past. 10 years of solitude, 10 years of silence, and still, the weight of it all pressed on him. The Legion had made him a machine, strength beyond human limits, bones laced with alloy, a heart wired for war. He'd been unstoppable, too unstoppable. When the fighting stopped, when the galaxy didn't need him anymore, he'd run. Not from enemies, but from himself. And from her. Kalia, the pilot with the crooked smile who'd slipped past his armor, who'd laughed at his grim face and kissed him under a sky full of stars. She'd died in his arms, blood on his hands, a stray shot in a firefight he couldn't stop. His shot, his failure. He'd buried her on some forgotten moon and walked away, swearing never to let anyone close again. Now, at 38, he felt older than the trees around him, a relic of a war that no longer mattered. Master, you're brooding again, Crix 7 said, waving a tiny hand in front of Zorak's face. I can tell. Your jaw's doing that clenchy thing. Is it her? The dead girl? You mutter her name when you sleep, you know. Super creepy. Zorak's grip tightened on the axe handle, knuckles whitening. Keep talking, and I'll melt you down for scrap. Threats. Crix 7 chirped, hopping back. That's more like it. There's the old Zorak. Now, how about we test my new toy? Acid-dipped razor net. Perfect for intruders or, really aggressive squirrels. Come on, say yes. I'm bored out of my circuits. Zorak grabbed a canteen from a stump and took a swig, the cool water tasting of the river that carved through Eryndor's heart. The planet was alive, green and wild, vines dangling from branches like traps waiting to snap. It was nothing like the ashen wastelands he'd fought on, nothing like the cold steel of Legion ships. Here he could breathe. Here he could pretend the past didn't exist. But pretending only went so far when your body was a weapon and your dreams were a battlefield. A low hum cut through the air, sharp and sudden, pulling him from his thoughts. It started faint, a vibration under his boots, then grew louder, a pulse that rattled the leaves. The mist thickened, swirling like it had a mind of its own, drawn toward the forest's depths. Zorak dropped the canteen, axe raised, every instinct screaming. "Crix, what's that?" The droid's eyes flickered as it scanned. Master, I'm getting something." Energy spike, massive, half a click west. Not tech, not natural, something freaky. Like, we're gonna die freaky. Details, Zorak snapped, already moving toward the sound, boots crunching moss. Details, Crix, 7 scurried after him. Big, weird, and probably deadly. Could be a ship, could be a rift, could be a forest god with a grudge. Want me to arm the razor net? Please say yes. Stay close, Zorak ordered, his voice a quiet blade. The hum buzzed at his chest now, electric, primal, tugging at something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt since the wars. He pushed through vines and branches, the air growing heavy, charged like a storm about to break. His pulse quickened, not from fear, but from a strange, unplaceable pull. They broke into a clearing, and Zorak stopped cold. A tree stood there, silver, enormous, its trunk rising 30 feet, roots sprawling like a web across the ground. It glowed, faint pulses of light rippling through its bark, matching the hum that filled the air. It didn't look like part of the forest, it looked like it owned it. "Sweet circuits, Crix," 7 whispered, inching behind Zorak. "That's no tree. That's alive." Zorak stepped forward, axe in one hand, every muscle coiled. The closer he got, the stronger the pull. A heat in his gut, a whisper in his skull he couldn't shake. He reached out, fingers hovering over the bark. "Crix, readings?" Spiking, the droid squeaked. "Energy's off the scale." "Master, don't." His hand touched the trunk, and the world exploded. The tree shuddered, cracks racing up its surface as green light, bright, alive, burst from within. Zorak staggered back, axe raised, but his eyes locked on the figure emerging from the splintered wood. She stepped out like a vision carved from desire. Her skin shimmered emerald, catching the mist like a living gem. Silver hair cascaded down her back, framing a body that screamed danger. Full curves, taut muscle, a sway that hit him like a punch. Her eyes, violet and slit like a predator's, pinned him where he stood, and Zorak felt his throat tighten. She was stunning, yes, but it was more. Raw hunger radiated from her, a force that slammed into him like a tidal wave. "Master!" Crix, 7 yelped, ducking behind his legs. "She's gonna kill us. Or eat us. Or, oh, scrap, I don't want to know." She moved toward him, silent, barefoot on the moss, her gaze never wavering. Up close, he saw the patterns on her skin. Faint, glowing lines like circuits etched in light. She stopped inches away, her scent flooding his senses. Earth, flowers, and something dark, something that made his blood pound. His body reacted before his mind could. Heat surging through him, raw and unbidden. "Who are you?" he rasped, axe still up, though his arm trembled. Not from fear, but from her. She tilted her head, studying him like prey. Then, her hand pressed against his chest, cold and searing all at once. A jolt ripped through him. Memories of Kalia, of death, of war, burned away under her touch. His knees buckled, but he held firm, gray eyes meeting violet. "You," she said, her voice a melody that sank into his bones, "have freed me." Her fingers slid to his jaw, nails grazing his skin, and she leaned in, lips brushing his ear. "I am Lyra Vethis, and you are mine." Zorak's breath hitched. His axe clattered to the ground, hands flexing at his sides. "I don't belong to anyone," he growled, but the words fell hollow. She pressed closer, her body molding to his, heat and need pouring off her in waves. "You will," she whispered, her smile sharp and wild, and the forest hummed with her promise. Master, Crick Seven's voice was a squeak. Can I panic now? Zorak didn't answer. Lyra was a storm, beautiful, deadly, inescapable, and he was caught. The Godslayer was waking up, and damn if it didn't feel good. The fire crackled in the small stone hearth of Zorak Veyn's cabin, casting flickering shadows across the rough wooden walls. Outside, Eryndor's forest whispered in the night, the silver trees swaying under a moonless sky. Zorak sat on a stool, elbows on his knees, staring at the woman who'd turned his quiet life upside down. Lyra Vethis stood by the window, her emerald skin glowing faintly in the firelight, silver hair spilling over her shoulders like liquid starlight. She hadn't said much since they'd stumbled back here, but her presence filled the room, heavy, electric, impossible to ignore. So, Zorak said, breaking the silence, his voice rough as ever. You're what? Some kind of forest spirit? A ghost? Give me something to work with here. Lyra turned, her violet eyes locking onto his with that same predatory intensity. She moved toward him, slow and deliberate, her hips swaying like a pendulum. The thin blanket he'd tossed her, an old gray thing from his bunk, clung to her curves, barely covering what it was meant to. I am Primora, she said, her voice a low melody that sent a shiver down his spine. One of the first, held in that tree for millennia, waiting. Waiting for what? Zorak asked, leaning back slightly as she stopped in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating off her. Her lips curved, sharp and knowing. For you. She reached out, fingers brushing his chest again, and that jolt hit him, cold, then hot like a live wire sparking under his skin. His breath caught, and he grabbed her wrist, holding it firm. Don't, he warned, gray eyes narrowing. I don't know what you're playing at, but I'm not your toy. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in, her face inches from his, her scent, wildflowers, and something darker, flooding his senses. I'm not playing, she whispered, her breath warm against his jaw. You woke me, Zorak Veyn. You felt it, the spark. We're bound now. Bound. He let go of her wrist, standing abruptly, putting space between them. His heart was pounding, and not just from anger. Lady, I don't do bound. I've got enough chains in my head without adding yours. From the corner, Crick's 7 piped up, its red eyes glinting as it polished a small, suspiciously sharp gadget. She's got a point, Master. That tree went boom the second you touched it. Coincidence? Nah, you're screwed, probably literally, judging by how she's eyeing you. Shut it, Crick's, Zorak snapped, shooting the droid a glare. He turned back to Lyra, crossing his arms over his bare chest, muscles flexing under the scars. Start talking. What's a Primora? Why were you in that tree? And why me? Lyra straightened, the blanket slipping slightly to reveal the curve of her shoulder. She didn't bother fixing it. Either she didn't care, or she knew exactly what she was doing. Zorak's jaw tightened as he forced his eyes back to her face. The Primora were the first to walk the stars, she said, her voice softening, tinged with something like sorrow. We built worlds, shaped galaxies. But our power, it grew too strong, too wild. I was one of the last, sealed away by my own kind because I couldn't control it. Control what? Zorak pressed, though a part of him wasn't sure he wanted the answer. She stepped closer again, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. This, she said, and pressed her hand to his chest once more. This time, the jolt wasn't just heat. It was a flood, a rush of energy that made his vision blur. He saw flashes, green light, twisting vines, a man's face burned to ash in an instant. Her voice echoed in his skull. I loved him once. He touched me, and he died. My power consumes. The images faded, and Zorak stumbled back, breathing hard, his skin tingling where she'd touched him. What the hell was that? He growled, steadying himself against the wall. A memory, Lyra said, her eyes dimming. My curse. I burn what I touch, unless it's strong enough to hold me. She looked at him, almost pleading. You are. I felt it when you freed me. You're different. Different, Zorak repeated, voice flat. He rubbed his chest, the spot still warm. Yeah, that's one way to put it. The Legion had made him a freak, built him to kill, to survive what no human could. But this was something else. He didn't like how her words stirred him, how they dug at the part of him that had been dead since Kaliya. Master, she's basically saying you're her perfect match. Crix, Seven chimed in, its tone gleeful. Like cosmically speaking, should I start planning the wedding? I could rig the cake with explosives. Boom, confetti, and carnage. Enough, Zorak said, glaring at the droid before turning back to Lyra. So you're dangerous. Great. Why were you locked up, and what's this bound nonsense? Lyra's gaze dropped, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket. My people feared me, she said quietly. I was too much. My touch brought life, but also death. They sealed me in that tree to protect the galaxy and themselves. As for you, she looked up, eyes blazing again. Your strength called to me. I've been asleep, dreaming, waiting for someone who could withstand me. You did more than free me, Zorak. You woke something inside me. He snorted, though his pulse was racing. Woke something? Lady, you're the one who popped out of a tree like a damn jack-in-the-box. I was just trying to chop wood. She smiled, a flicker of amusement breaking through her intensity. And yet, here we are. She stepped closer, the blanket slipping further, and Zorak's throat went dry. You feel it too. Don't lie to me. He did. Damn it, he did. Ever since that first touch, there'd been a hum under his skin, a pull he couldn't shake. It wasn't just her body, though that alone was enough to make any man lose his mind. It was something deeper, like she'd flipped a switch he didn't know he had. But admitting it, that was a step he wasn't ready to take. Master, she's got you sweating, Crix, Seven said, hopping onto a crate for a better view. I haven't seen you this rattled since that time you punched a hole through a tank and got stuck. Need me to fetch a bucket of water? Cool you off. Keep talking, and I'll use you as kindling, Zorak shot back, but his eyes stayed on Lyra. Look, I don't know what you think I am, but I'm not your savior. I'm just a guy trying to live quiet. Quiet. Lyra's laugh was soft, dangerous. A man like you doesn't hide in a forest for peace. You're running. From what? She tilted her head, studying him, and for a moment he swore she saw right through him, past the scars, past the Legion, straight to the hole Kaliya had left. He turned away, grabbing a shirt from a hook and yanking it on, needing something, anything between him and her gaze. Doesn't matter, he muttered. You're here now. What do you want? You, she said simply, and the word hit him like a punch. She stepped up behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder, fingers digging in just enough to make him tense. I've been alone for millennia, Zorak. Trapped, dreaming of a touch that wouldn't break. You gave me that. I won't let it go. He spun to face her, anger flaring. I don't belong to you. Get that through your head. Her eyes flashed, but she didn't back down. You don't understand yet, she said, voice low. It's not ownership. It's need. I can't control this alone. Not anymore. Her hand slid down his arm, slow and deliberate, and that heat surged again, making his breath hitch. And you can't deny it's waking something in you too. Master, she's flirting and threatening you. Crix, Seven said, clapping its tiny hands. This is better than hollow dramas. Should I record it? Blackmail material for later. Zorak ignored the droid, staring at Lyra. She was right. He felt it. A spark, a pull, something alive and restless clawing its way up from the ashes of who he'd been. But he'd spent 10 years burying that man, the Godslayer, the killer, the lover who'd failed. Letting her in meant risking all again. Back off, he said, stepping away, voice hard. I need air. He pushed out the door into the night, the cool mist hitting his face like a slap. Behind him, Lyra watched, silent, her presence still burning in his mind. Trouble didn't even begin to cover it. Zorak stomped through the undergrowth, boots sinking into the moss as Eryndor's forest closed around him. The silver trees loomed overhead, their faint glow cutting through the mist like ghostly lanterns. He needed space, air, anything to shake the heat she'd left simmering under his skin. That touch, that voice, those damn eyes. It was like she'd reached into his chest and flipped a switch he'd spent a decade trying to kill. He growled, kicking a rock into the shadows, the sharp crack echoing through the stillness. "Master, you're stomping around like a pissed-off rhino." Crix 7's voice rang out as the droid scurried after him, its red eyes bobbing in the dark. "What's the plan? Punch a tree? Yell at the moon? Or are we finally going to talk about how green ladies got you all hot and bothered?" "Shut up, Crix," Zorak snapped, not slowing down. "I'm fine." "Fine? You're radiating tension like a busted reactor." Crix 7 darted in front of him, blocking his path with its tiny frame. "Look, I get it. She's a walking fantasy with a side of danger. But storming off into the woods? That's not a plan. That's just you being dramatic." Zorak glared down at the droid, hands flexing. "Move, or I'll step on you." "Promises, promises," Crix 7 muttered, sidestepping with a huff. "Fine, brood away. But if she follows you out here and you two start making out, I'm recording it. Prime blackmail material." Zorak ignored him, pushing deeper into the forest until he reached the river, a ribbon of jade cutting through the trees, its surface shimmering under the faint light. He stopped at the bank, chest heaving, and splashed cold water on his face. It didn't help. Her words kept looping in his head. "You're different. We're bound." And worse, he couldn't shake the way his body had reacted. 10 years of burying everything, rage, guilt, desire, and she'd ripped it all open with one touch. He straightened, water dripping from his jaw, and froze. Across the river, Lyra stood under a low-hanging branch, the blanket gone, replaced by nothing but the mist clinging to her emerald skin. She was bathing, her silver hair plastered to her back, water streaming over her curves in slow, deliberate rivulets. The sight hit him like a gut punch, full breast catching the light, hips swaying as she moved, every inch of her a weapon designed to unravel him. She turned, violet eyes meeting his, and a slow smile curved her lips. "Zorak," she called, her voice cutting through the night like a siren song. "You can't run from me." He should have turned away, should have marched back to the cabin and locked the door. But his feet wouldn't move. His breath grew ragged as she stepped out of the water, droplets sliding down her skin, each one catching the glow of the trees. She walked toward him, unhurried, the mist parting around her like she commanded it. Up close, he saw the patterns on her body again, faint, pulsing lines that seemed to hum with her every step. "What are you doing?" he rasped, voice thick, hands clenched at his sides. "Washing away the centuries," she said, stopping just out of reach. Water glistened on her lips, and she tilted her head, studying him. "You're staring. Do you like what you see?" He swallowed hard, forcing his eyes up to hers. "Put something on." "What?" Her smile widened, sharp and teasing. "Does this trouble you?" She stepped closer, the air between them crackling, and reached out, brushing his chest through his shirt. That Joel hit again, hotter this time, and he grabbed her wrist, holding it tight. "Stop," he growled, though his grip wavered. "I'm not playing your game." "It's not a game," she said, stepping into him, her bare skin inches from his. "You feel it, the pull, the spark. I've been alone so long, Zorak. Trapped, dreaming of this." Her free hand slid up his arm, nails grazing his bicep, and his resolve cracked like thin ice. He let go of her wrist, stepping back, but she followed, relentless. "You don't get it," he said, voice low. "I've lost people. I don't let anyone in. Not anymore." Her eyes softened, but the hunger didn't fade. "I've lost too," she whispered, her hand resting over his heart. "I loved once a warrior strong like you. My touch burned him to ash. I swore I'd never feel again. But you," she pressed closer, her body brushing his, and he felt that heat surge, primal and unstoppable. "You can hold me." Before he could answer, a sharp whoosh cut through the air. Zorak spun, shoving Lyra behind him as a plasma bolt scorched the ground where she'd stood. Across the river, shapes emerged from the mist. 6 figures in patchwork armor, weapons gleaming, their leader a hulking brute with a cybernetic eye glowing red. "Found her!" the leader barked, leveling a rifle. "The Green Witch, Drace Salvaris, want her alive. Kill the guy." "Master, we've got company." Crix 7 yelped, darting out from the bushes, its eyes flashing. Permission to unleash hell? I've got a razor net prepped. Do it, Zorak snarled, already moving. He grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her toward cover as Crix, 7 launched a tangle of gleaming wire across the river. It hit 2 mercs, slicing through armor and flesh with a wet crunch, their screams echoing as they fell. Zorak shoved Lyra behind a tree, his body shielding hers as bolts tore through the night. Stay down, he ordered, then charged. The old instincts kicked in, the Godslayer waking with a roar. He ducked a shot, grabbed a rock from the bank, and hurled it with Legion-enhanced force. It smashed the leader's cyber eye, dropping him instantly, blood and circuit spraying. Nice throw. Crix, 7 cheered, waddling up with a makeshift blaster cobbled from scrap. It fired, taking out another merc in a burst of sparks. Oh, I've missed this. Zorak didn't stop. He closed the gap, slamming a fist into the next merc's chest, bones cracking under the blow. Another swung a vibroblade, too slow. Zorak caught the wrist, twisted, and snapped it. The man's scream cut short by a knee to the jaw. But then Lyra moved. She stepped out from the tree, naked and fearless, her skin glowing brighter. Enough, she said, and raised a hand. The air shimmered, and vines erupted from the ground, thick, thorned, alive, wrapping around the last 2 mercs. They thrashed, armor crumpling, blood pooling as the plants tightened. Zorak stared, chest heaving, as the forest fell silent. Lyra turned to him, her eyes blazing, blood flecking her emerald skin. They came for me, she said, voice steady. They always will. Who's Drace Salvaris? He demanded, wiping sweat from his brow. She hesitated, then stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. That jolt hit again, but this time it carried a vision, golden skin, red eyes, a voice promising power. He made you, her voice whispered in his mind. He wants me. Zorak pulled back, reeling. What the hell does that mean? He's the one who created you, she said aloud, her gaze piercing. A lord of stars, obsessed with the Primora. He thinks you're the key to me, to my power, and he'll kill to get it. Great, Zorak muttered, glancing at the bodies. So much for quiet. Master, that was awesome. Crix, 7 chirped, hopping over a corpse. Can we keep her? She's like a murder goddess. Think of the chaos we could. Quiet, Zorak cut in, turning to Lyra. She stood there, still bare, still unshaken, and damn if she didn't look like she belonged in the carnage. You're trouble, he said, voice low. I am, she agreed, stepping into his space again, her body brushing his. But you're drawn to it. I see it in you, the Godslayer. You can't hide from me. He didn't answer, but his pulse said enough. She was right, too right, and it scared the hell out of him. The cabin felt like a damn cage now, the air thick with the stink of blood and tension. Zorak leaned against the wall, arms crossed tight over his scarred chest, gray eyes boring into Lyra Vethis as she paced by the hearth. Her emerald skin shimmered, flecked with dried crimson from the mercs she'd turned into mulch out there. But she moved like it was nothing, like death was just a warm-up. The blanket he'd tossed her earlier hung loose around her shoulders, slipping just enough to mess with his focus, but he kept his jaw locked. She dropped a grenade on him by the river. Drace Salvaris, the bastard who'd forged him, and it was chewing at his guts. Truth or not, it pissed him off, and the way she kept pulling at him didn't help. Master, can we talk about how she turned those assholes into fertilizer? Crix, 7 chirped, hopping onto a crate, its red eyes glinting as it fiddled with a blaster cobbled from junk. I mean, vines. That's next-level carnage. My razor net's crying in shame over here. Focus, Crix, Zorak growled, rubbing the back of his neck, fingers brushing the subdermal implants that still hummed under his skin. She says this Drace guy's coming. We need a move. Lyra stopped pacing, spinning to face him, her violet eyes cutting through the firelight like twin blades. She stepped closer, barefoot on the rough wood, her presence hitting him like a shockwave. Not just for me, she said, her voice low, sinking into him. For us. He wants what we are. Your strength, my power. Thinks it's his ticket to rule the stars. Zorak's jaw clenched hard enough to crack stone. And what the hell are we? You keep yapping about bound this and fate that, but I didn't ask for your cosmic leash. She tilted her head, silver hair sliding over her shoulder like molten metal. You touched me, Zorak. You woke me. That's not some random fluke. It's written in the damn stars. Her voice softened, but it carried weight, like a blade wrapped in silk. I felt you in my sleep, a shadow strong enough to hold me. And when you did, she reached out, fingers brushing his chest, and a jolt ripped through him, hot, electric, buzzing down his spine. He grabbed her wrist, pinning it, but the heat stuck, clawing at his control. Cut that out, he snarled, gray eyes narrowing, though his grip didn't tighten like it should have. I'm not your damn puppet. Not for you. Not for this Drace prick. You're not, she said, stepping into him, her body close enough to make the air crackle. You're more. He made you, mixed Primora blood with human steel, but you're no tool. You're the only one who can stand me. Her free hand slid up his arm, nails grazing the scars, and his pulse kicked up despite the growl in his throat. And I need you. Need me? He let her wrist go, stepping back, but the wall stopped him cold, boxing him in. For what? To fight your war? To bleed like that poor bastard you torched? Her eyes darkened, a shadow of pain flickering through the violet. No, she whispered, pressing closer, the blanket slipping to show the curve of her hip. To live. To keep me from breaking everything I touch again. Her voice trembled, just for a second, and damn if it didn't hit him somewhere deep. I've destroyed before, loved and lost. But you're my anchor. Anchor, Zorak snorted, though his blood was pounding. I'm a wreck, lady. You're betting on the wrong horse. Tree pun intended. Master, she's got a point. Crix, Seven piped up, its metal voice dripping with glee. You're a walking tank, and she's a murder goddess. Match made in hell. Should I prep the ship? I say we blast off, hunt this Drace guy, and shove a plasma bolt up his. Enough, Zorak snapped, shooting the droid a glare that could melt steel before turning back to Lyra. If Drace wants you, he's not getting you. But we're not sitting here like targets. We take it down my way. Lyra's lips curved, a flicker of relief mixed with something sharper. Hunger, maybe. Nexus core, she said, stepping back, giving him space but not letting go of that pull. His stronghold. That's where he'll be. Nexus core, Zorak echoed, nodding once, sharp and final. Fine. We hit him at dawn. Crix, get the ship hot. Finally, Crix, Seven jumped off the crate, clapping its tiny hands like a kid at a bloodbath. Action. Gore. Explosions. I'll juice the engines, and maybe rig some fun. Acid cannons. Anyone? It bolted out, leaving Zorak alone with Lyra's stare boring into him. She watched him, quiet for a beat, then closed the gap again. You're pissed, she said, her voice a low hum. At him. At me. Damn straight, he muttered, running a hand through his hair, the strands damp with sweat. I've spent 10 years burying who I was. Now you're telling me some Star-Lord freak cooked me up for this? For you. Not just for me, she said, her hand landing on his chest again, firm this time. For you. You've been hiding, Zorak, running from the man you are. I see him, the Godslayer. The fire. The steel. Her fingers pressed harder, and that spark flared, buzzing under his skin like a live wire. Let me wake him. He grabbed her shoulders, shoving her back a step, but his hands lingered, caught in her heat. You don't know what you're digging up, he said, voice tight, Kalia's ghost flashing behind his eyes. Her blood, her last breath. That guy, he's a killer. He burns everything he gets close to. I lost. He cut off, turning his head jaw-locked. Lyra's hand caught his jaw, yanking his gaze back to hers, her touch firm but not cruel. You lost her, she said, soft but sure. I know. I see it, the guilt, the weight. I got my own scars, Zorak, but I'm not her, and you're not that man anymore. He stared at her, her fingers grounding him even as they burned. Then what am I? Mine, she said, low and fierce, and before he could snap back, she leaned in, her breath hot against his lips. She didn't kiss him, not yet, just held there, daring him to move. The air crackled, her scent, earth and wildflowers, flooding his head, and damn if he didn't feel it. That pull, that spark, clawing up from the ashes he'd buried. "Back off," he growled, stepping away, breaking the spell. "I need to breathe." He shoved out the door, the misty night slapping his face as he stomped into the forest. The silver trees loomed, their faint glow cutting through the haze like knives. He needed space, distance from her, from the heat she kept stoking. That touch, that voice, it was like she cracked open a vault he'd bolted shut, and the Godslayer was rattling the bars. He kicked a rock into the shadows, the crack echoing loud, and cursed under his breath. "Master, you're stomping like a pissed-off beast." Crick 7's voice rang out, the droid scurrying after him, red eyes bobbing in the dark. "What's the play? Punch a tree? Scream at the stars? Or are we finally going to admit Green Lady's got you twisted up?" "Shut it, Crix," Zorak snapped, not slowing. "I'm good." "Good? You're leaking tension like a busted fuel line." Crix 7 darted ahead, planting its tiny ass in his path. "Look, I get it. She's a storm with legs, all danger and glow. But storming off? That's not a fix. That's you being a drama king." Zorak glared down, fists flexing. "Move, or I'll punt you." "Promises," Crix 7 muttered, sidestepping with a huff. "Fine, brood away. But if she trails you out here, I'm betting on fireworks, and I'm recording it." Zorak ignored the jab, pushing deeper until he hit the river, jade water slicing through the trees, shimmering under the faint light. He stopped at the bank, chest heaving, and splashed cold water on his face. It didn't do shit. Her words kept looping. "You're different. We're bound." And worse, that hum under his skin wouldn't quit. 10 years of locking everything down, rage, guilt, the man he'd been, and she'd torn it open with one damn touch. He straightened, water dripping from his jaw, and froze. Across the river, Lyra stood under a low branch, the blanket gone, mist curling around her emerald skin like a second skin. She was washing off the fight, silver hair plastered to her back, water tracing her frame in slow rivers. The sight hit him hard, every curve catching the glow, her presence pulling at him like gravity. She turned, violet eyes nailing him, and a slow smile curved her lips. "Zorak," she called, her voice cutting the night like a blade. "You can't outrun me." He should have turned, should have hauled ass back to the cabin and bolted the door. But his boots stayed planted, breath going ragged as she stepped out, water sliding off her, mist parting like she owned it. She moved toward him, steady and sure, the air buzzing as she closed in. Up close, those glowing lines on her skin pulsed, humming with every step. "What are you doing?" he rasped, voice thick, hands balled at his sides. "Cleaning off the centuries," she said, stopping just out of reach, water gleaming on her lips. "You're staring. Does it bother you?" He swallowed, forcing his eyes to hers. "Cover up." "What?" Her smile sharpened, teasing but dangerous. "Does it shake you?" She stepped closer, the air sparking, and brushed his chest through his shirt. That jolt hit, hotter, deeper, and he grabbed her wrist, holding tight. "Stop," he growled, though his grip wavered. "I'm not your game." "It's not a game," she said, pressing into him, her heat sinking through the fabric. "You feel it, the pull." "I've been alone too long, Zorak. Trapped, dreaming of this." Her free hand slid up his arm, nails grazing, and his walls cracked just a hair. "You don't get it," he said, voice low, letting her wrist go, but not stepping back. "I've lost people. I don't open that door. Not anymore." Her eyes softened, but the fire didn't dim. "I've lost too," she whispered, her hand settling over his heart, steady and warm. "I loved once, a warrior strong like you. My touch ended him. I swore I'd never feel again. But you..." She leaned in, her body brushing his, and that heat surged wild and alive. "You can hold me." Before he could fire back, a sharp whoosh sliced the air. Zorak spun, shoving Lyra behind him as a plasma bolt scorched the ground where she'd stood. Across the river, shapes broke through the mist. 6 armored bastards, weapons gleaming, their leader a hulking brute with a cyber eye glowing red. "Found her," the leader barked, leveling a rifle. The Green Witch, Drace Salvaris want her alive. Waste the guy. Master, we've got trouble. Crix, 7 yelped, popping from the bushes, eyes flashing. Razornet time? Say yes. Do it, Zorak snarled, already moving. He yanked Lyra toward a tree. Shielding her as Crix, 7 launched a tangle of wire across the river. It hit 2 mercs, slicing through armor and meat, their screams wet and short as they dropped. Zorak shoved Lyra behind the tree, his body a wall between her and the hail of plasma bolts tearing through the night. The air stank of scorched moss and blood, the riverbank lighting up with muzzle flashes as the remaining mercs charged. Crix 7's Razornet had taken out 2, their corpses twitching in a mess of wire and guts. But the other 4 were closing fast, the brute with the cyber eye barking orders like a rabid dog. Stay down, Zorak growled at Lyra, his voice a blade cutting through the chaos. He didn't wait for her to argue, didn't have time. The old instincts roared awake, the Godslayer shaking off a decade of rust. He ducked a bolt that singed his hair, grabbed a fist-sized rock from the bank, and hurled it with Legion-honed force. It smashed the leader's cyber eye dead on, a wet crunch of metal and bone echoing as the bastard dropped, blood and sparks spraying across the water. Bullseye! Crix, 7 cheered, waddling up with a blaster it had slapped together from scrap, its red eyes gleaming like a kid at a slaughterfest. The droid fired, a jagged burst of energy taking out another merc's chest in a shower of meat and smoke. Oh, I've missed this, Master. Chaos is my fuel. Zorak didn't pause to gloat. He charged the next merc, a wiry bastard swinging a vibroblade with a snarl. Too slow. Zorak caught the wrist mid-swing, twisted hard, and snapped it like a twig, the guy's scream choking off as Zorak's knee slammed into his jaw, dropping him cold. The 4th merc lunged, rifle blazing, but Zorak rolled under the shots, coming up with a fist to the gut that folded the guy in half, ribs cracking like drywood. He finished it with an elbow to the skull, blood splattering the moss. Enough of this shit, he muttered, chest heaving, turning back to Lyra, just in time to see her step out from the tree, her emerald skin flaring bright as a damn star. She raised a hand, and the ground answered, vines bursting up, thick and thorned, snaking through the dirt like living spears. They wrapped the last merc standing, a stocky thug who'd been lining up a shot, and tightened fast. His armor crumpled, a scream ripping out as thorns punched through, blood pooling dark onto the silver trees. Zorak stared, breath ragged, as the forest went quiet, the vines settling back into the soil like they'd never moved. Lyra turned to him, her violet eyes blazing, blood flecking her glowing skin. They came for me, she said, voice steady as steel. They always will. Who's Drace Salvaris? He demanded, wiping sweat and dirt from his brow, the adrenaline still pumping hot through his veins. She hesitated, then stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. Not pushing, just there. That jolt hit again, softer this time, but it carried something, a flash of golden skin, red eyes, a voice dripping with promises of power. He made you. Her voice whispered in his head, sharp and clear. He wants me. Zorak jerked back, head spinning. What the hell does that mean? He's the one who forged you, she said aloud, her gaze piercing through him like a laser. A lord of stars, obsessed with the Primora. He thinks you're the key to me, to my power, and he'll kill to claim it. Fantastic, Zorak muttered, kicking a merc's rifle into the river, watching it sink with a splash. So much for laying low. Master, that was badass. Crix, 7 chirped, hopping over a corpse, its tiny hands clapping. Can we keep her? She's a walking death machine. Think of the havoc we could. Quiet, Zorak cut in, turning to Lyra. She stood there, unshaken, blood and mist clinging to her like a second skin, and damn if she didn't look like she belonged in the carnage. You're a magnet for trouble, he said, voice low, rough as gravel. I am, she agreed, stepping into his space, her presence a heat he couldn't dodge. But you're built for it. I see it, the Godslayer. You can't bury him from me. He didn't answer, but his pulse hammered the truth loud enough. She was right, 2, right? And it twisted his guts. We're not waiting for more of these assholes, he said, nodding toward the bodies. Nexus Core. We end this. Together, she said, her hand lingering on his arm, that spark humming between them. He didn't pull away this time. The flight to Nexus Core was a blur of steel and stars, the ship's engines groaning as Zorak gripped the controls. The rust bucket he'd patched together years ago rattled through hyperspace. Cricks, 7 buzzing around the cockpit like a caffeinated gnat, tweaking systems and muttering about optimal kill configs. Lyra stood behind him, her shadow a constant weight, her scent, earth and something wild, cutting through the recycled air. The viewport glowed purple, Nexus Core looming closer, a planet of jagged crystal spires stabbing a sky streaked with violet. You're quiet, Lyra said, leaning over his shoulder, her breath warm on his neck, stirring shit he didn't want stirred. Thinking, he grunted, eyes locked on the controls, fingers flexing. Drace made me. What's that mean? A lab? A vat? I don't even know what I am anymore. You're Zorak Veyn, she said, her hand landing on his shoulder, steady as stone. The rest is just noise. He shaped you, but you carved your own path. Did I? He shot her a look, gray eyes hard as flint. Or did he carve this, us? She smiled, sharp and certain. No one carved me, but you. That first touch, it was yours. He didn't reply, but her words sank deep, rattling around in his skull like loose bolts. The ship shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace, Nexus Core filling the viewport. A glittering hellhole, its spires clawing the dark, a black crystal citadel pulsing at the heart like a beating tumor. There, Lyra said, pointing, her voice tight. He's waiting. Master, I've got a playlist queued. Crix, 7 announced, hopping onto a console, its red eyes flashing. How about Slaughter Symphony? Heavy beats, perfect for cracking heads. Play it, Zorak said, standing as the ship angled down, the landing gear whining. Gear up. We're storming hell. Lyra's hand slid down his arm, that spark flaring again, hot and alive. Not hell, she murmured, her eyes locked on his. Ours. He met her gaze, the heat between them crackling, and nodded. Whatever Drace had cooked up, they'd face it, side by side. The citadel hit them like a punch, walls of black crystal towering 50 feet, runes carved deep and glowing with a sickly green light. Zorak kicked the ship's hatch open, boots hitting the ground hard. Lyra at his flank, Crix, 7 scurrying behind with a blaster in one hand and a razor net primed in the other. The air was thick, electric, a hum rattling his bones as they pushed through a courtyard littered with shattered statues. Old Primora faces, maybe, staring blank into the void. Creepy as shit, Crix, 7 muttered, kicking a stone head. Master, you feel that? Like the place is alive. It is, Lyra said, her glow dimming as she scanned the walls, her voice tight. He's woven my kind's power into it. Bastard's been planning this. Great, Zorak growled, gripping a scavenged plasma rifle, its weight familiar in his hands. Let's give him a welcome party. A roar split the air, deep, mechanical, shaking the ground. From the citadel's maw, Drace Salvaris stepped out, golden skin gleaming under the violet sky, red eyes burning like twin suns. He was tall, lean, draped in a cloak of shifting black scales, a cracked device pulsing in his hand, rune-covered, spitting green sparks. Behind him, a dozen mercs fanned out, armor-patched and weapons hot, flanked by 2 hulking drones, their cannons whirring to life. Zorak Veyn, Drace's voice boomed, smooth and venomous, cutting through the hum. My finest work. And you. His eyes slid to Lyra, a grin splitting his face. The Primora prize. Together, you'll birth my empire. Fuck your empire, Zorak snarled, raising the rifle. You're done. Drace laughed, sharp and cold. Done? This is destiny. He slammed the device into the ground, and the runes on the walls flared, green light surging into Lyra. She gasped, staggering, her skin flickering as vines erupted around her, wild, uncontrolled, lashing the air. Lyra, Zorak roared, dropping the rifle and lunging for her as the mercs opened fire. He tackled her behind a statue, bolts scorching the stone, her body trembling against his. "Hold it together." "I can't," she rasped, her eyes flashing white, vines snaking up his legs, thorns biting deep. "It's too much, Zorak, get out." "No chance," he growled, grabbing her shoulders, pinning her gaze to his. "You're not breaking. Not on my watch." Her energy slammed into him, raw, chaotic, tearing at his nerves. But he held firm, the Legion steel in his bones anchoring him. "Perfect," Drace shouted, dodging a stray vine, his grin widening. "The Union, my victory." "Eat shit," Zorak spat, shoving Lyra down and charging. He grabbed a merc's rifle mid-swing, smashed it into the guy's face, skull caving with a wet crack, then spun, firing into the drones. One blew apart in a shower of sparks, but the other's cannon roared, a bolt grazing his arm, blood sizzling as it hit the ground. "Master, back up." "Crix," 7 yelped, launching its razor net. It sliced through 2 mercs, blood spraying as they crumpled, and the droid cackled. "Take that, you shiny pricks." Lyra surged up, her glow blinding, vines thickening as she screamed, a sound that shook the citadel. "Stay away from him," she roared, and the ground split, roots spearing a merc through the chest, lifting him like a rag doll as he choked on his own blood. "You can't control it." Drace laughed, raising the device again, green light pulsing harder. "You're mine, both of you." "Lyra, fight it," Zorak yelled, slamming a fist into another merc's throat, dropping him, then diving for her. She thrashed, vines cutting his legs, his arms, but he grabbed her face, forcing her to see him. "You're stronger than this. Stay with me." Her eyes flickered, violet bleeding back in, and she clutched his wrists, her breath ragged. "Zorak." The vine slowed, trembling, her energy calming against his steel. Drace snarled, lunging with a blade drawn from his cloak, but Zorak spun, kicking his legs out. The bastard hit the ground hard, the device skittering away, cracked and sparking. Vines surged, wrapping Drace's arms, thorns digging in as he thrashed, blood pooling under him. "Master, he's toast." "Crix," 7 cheered, blasting the last merc into a smoking heap. "Finish him." Zorak held Lyra tight, her glow fading, her body slumping against his. "You stopped it," she whispered, hands shaking on his chest. "Told you I'd hold you," he rasped, blood dripping from cuts, his breath heavy. "We're not done." Drace coughed, clawing free, his golden skin torn. "You can't win," he spat, staggering up. "This bond, it'll birth a nightmare. I'll be back." He stumbled into the shadows, leaving blood and broken dreams behind. "Let him crawl," Lyra said, leaning into Zorak, her voice fierce despite the strain. "He's lost for now." "Master, that was insane." "Crix," 7 said, hopping over rubble. "Blood, guts, vines, best fight ever. Can we keep him?" Zorak smirked, gripping Lyra, her heat against him a damn lifeline. They'd shoved Drace back, but the war wasn't over. Not with that bastard's parting shot ringing in his ears. "You'll birth a nightmare," Drace had spat, and it gnawed at him, a splinter he couldn't dig out. Blood dripped from a dozen cuts, stinging sharp, and he glanced at the citadel's wreckage. Stone split, vines limp, the air heavy with death. Her glow flickered against his chest, her breath ragged but steady, and he felt the Godslayer clawing free, awake and hungry after a decade in chains. "We're not staying," he growled, his voice scraping like a blade on stone. "This place is a graveyard. Let it rot." Lyra's hand tightened on his arm, nails grazing a fresh gash, sparking a jolt that hit him low. "Eryndor," she said, violet eyes burning into his, fierce and unyielding. "Our fight's not done, but that's home." "Yeah," he rasped, pulling her closer, her warmth cutting through the chill of Nexus Core's dying light. "Move it, Crix, ship now." "On it, master." Crix, 7 chirped, scurrying off through the debris, dragging a chunk of shattered drone like a prize. "Engines'll cough, but they'll fly. Let's ditch this shithole before more assholes drop in." Its red eyes bobbed into the dust, leaving them standing in the ruin, her heat a steady pulse against him. She didn't pull away, just pressed in, her forehead brushing his jaw, her scent, earth and wildflowers, flooding his head. "You're still pissed," she murmured, her voice low, sinking into his bones. "At him. At this." "Damn right," he muttered, his hand sliding to her waist, smearing blood between them. 10 years I buried this shit. Now he's saying he made me for it? For you? Screws with my head. "You're Zorak Veyn," she said, her hand settling over his chest, firm and warm, grounding him. "He might have forged the steel, but you swung the blade. That's what I see." Her fingers pressed harder, that spark flaring under his skin, and damn if it didn't shake him loose. He didn't answer, just nodded, sharp and quick, and hauled her toward the ship. The rust bucket loomed through the haze, hatch creaking as he kicked it open, boots thudding on the deck. Lyra slid in behind him, her presence a hum he couldn't shake, and he dropped into the pilot's seat, hands gripping the controls as Crix, 7 buzzed around, muttering about kill configs. The engines roared, a guttural snarl, and they punched through the violet sky, hyperspace swallowing them in a blur of stars. Her shadow fell over him, steady and close, and he kept his eyes on the viewport, but that heat, her heat, kept clawing at him. "You're quiet," she said, leaning over his shoulder, her breath brushing his neck, stirring shit he didn't want stirred. Chewing on it, he grunted, knuckles whitening on the sticks. "Dre's cooked me up, some lab rat play. Now he's after us. Doesn't add up clean." "You're you," she said, her hand landing on his shoulder, steady as stone. "He shaped the raw stuff. I see the man who broke it free." Her voice was a low hum, cutting through the engine's growl, and it settled something jagged in his chest. The ship jolted, hyperspace spitting them out, and Eryndor loomed, emerald forest stretching wide, silver trees glowing under a misty dawn. He slammed the landing gear down near the cabin's ruins, dust kicking up, and stepped out, her hand brushing his as they hit the dirt. She waved at the wreckage. Vines surged, weaving through splintered logs, sprouting flowers in green and gold, turning the mess into something alive. The forest bent to her, a wild pulse under her glow. "Master, she's a damn forest god," Crix, 7 said, hopping through the sprouting chaos, red eyes wide. "Can she fix my blaster? Or make me a pal? I'm lonely, damn it." "Fix your own ass," Zorak grunted, watching her kneel, hands pressing into the soil. The ground thrummed, trees thickening, a river snaking through, her power reshaping their turf, fierce and tamed. She stood, turning to him, her glow soft but sharp. "This is ours," she said, stepping close, her body brushing his like a challenge. "No more hiding." "No more," he agreed, pulling her against him, hands sliding down her back, anchoring her there. The forest hummed, her energy sparking against his steel, and he felt it, a fire he'd thought was dead, burning hot and raw. Weeks rolled by, the oasis growing under her touch, trees heavy with fruit, vines draping their rebuilt cabin like a shield. He swung the axe, carving out a life, not a bunker, the rhythm steadying his bones. Every night, she'd find him, her hands on his shoulders, her voice a low murmur, their shadows tangling under the stars until the forest seemed to breathe with them. She was a storm he couldn't dodge, and he didn't try, their bond a heat that kept the ghost quiet. But peace was a fragile son of a bitch. One morning, he stood by the river, sharpening a blade, the jade water glinting under the sun, when Crix, 7 bolted from the trees, red eyes bugging out. "Master, incoming!" It yelped, waving its stubby arms like a lunatic. "Ship, big, nasty, guns bristling." He gripped the blade, steel cold in his palm, as Lyra stepped from the cabin, her patched jumpsuit clinging tight, hair wild from their last tumble in the moss. "Who?" she asked, her voice sharp, vines twitching at her feet like they smelled a fight. The ship slammed down, dust exploding, and a figure strode out, tall, lean, pale green skin glowing faint, violet eyes mirroring Lyra's like a twisted echo. Silvara Keth. Copper hair glinted short and jagged, armor hugging her frame, a plasma whip crackling in her hand. A dozen mercs fanned out, weapons hot, boots crushing the fresh growth. Sister, Silvara said, her voice cold as a blade, eyes flicking to Zorak with a predator's grin. You've been cozy. Silvara, Lyra hissed, stepping forward, the ground rumbling under her rage. What do you want? Him, Silvara said, pointing at Zorak, her smile cutting deep. You got your spark, I want mine. His Primora blood can wake me too. Over my corpse, Lyra snarled, her glow flaring, vines surging up, thick, thorned, glinting in the dawn. Happy to oblige, Silvara shot back, cracking her whip, the tips slicing a sapling clean in half with a hiss. Let's dance. Zorak moved, blade raised, shoving Lyra back a step. Stay put, he growled, but she grabbed his arm, her heat sinking into him. No, she said, pressing against him, eyes fierce. We fight together. The mercs charged, plasma bolts ripping the air, and he swung, blade cleaving a man's arm off, blood spraying as the guy's scream died fast. Lyra's vines lashed out, spearing two mercs through the chest, their bodies jerking as thorns tore them apart. Silvara laughed, whip cracking, slicing vines like paper as she closed in, her eyes locked on him. You're mine, she purred, lunging, her body slamming into his, knocking the breath from his lungs. She was fast, too damn fast, her whip coiling around his wrist, burning skin as she yanked him close, her breath hot against his ear. I'm better than her, feel it. Piss off, he snarled, smashing his forehead into her nose, a wet crunch sounding as she staggered, blood pouring. Lyra charged, tackling Silvara, vines wrapping her legs, dragging her down. He's mine, Lyra roared, fist smashing Silvara's jaw, blood splattering as the forest shook. Silvara grinned through the pain, whip slashing Lyra's side, carving a red line across her glow. Zorak gutted the last merc, blade twisting until the guy gurgled and dropped, then spun, grabbing Silvara's whip arm, snapping it at the elbow with a crack. She screamed, collapsing, but her eyes burned venom. This isn't over, she spat, rolling free, stumbling to her ship as it roared up. Let her limp back to Drace, Lyra said, panting, blood dripping from her side as she leaned into Zorak, her heat a steady pulse. She's done for now. Good, he growled, holding her tight, lips brushing her temple, tasting sweat and victory. Let them try again. Master, that was epic. Crix, 7 cheered, hopping over a corpse. Can I rig a trap for her? Spikes in a spotlight. Zorak laughed, rough and deep, pulling Lyra closer. Maybe, he said, her warmth sinking in. But I got my hands full. She smirked, hand sliding up his chest, nails grazing just enough to spark. You love it, she murmured, and he didn't argue, couldn't. The forest stretched wide, wild and alive, their new start forged in blood and fire.